Welcome to lunch, and along with it, Polymer for Flex Edges. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff today, because Polymer is a really cool project and I'm interested in it a lot. Not even necessarily where it is today, but where it can go. But it has a lot of prerequisite things that we need to understand in order to kind of get our heads around why it's cool right now. So actually, I'd like to talk about some of that. This is part of a different approach than this other stuff I've been talking about. This isn't Flex, this is an ActionScript. This is thoughts on Flex and ActionScript skills when we get to other platforms. So Polymer is a JavaScript project. It just so happens that it has a heck of a lot in common with the way we do Flex things and the way all of these things work. So without a lot of further ado, let's look at a couple things. So first, just to kind of understand some of what's what. This is just an application, kind of web application stuff that we might get expected to. We've got simple things in here like we can filter, the normal sorts of things that we'd expect in our Flex apps, et cetera, et cetera. The thing is, though, our nice little grids and data grids and things of that nature, but it's not Flex, it's just a JavaScript app. It has Java, it has all the things that we are used to, but it's not running in the Flash player, it's running in the virtual machine of the browser instead. So how do we build these is the question. And there's lots of different competing ideas, right? Obviously, Flex.js one is one, there's a number of different ways to go. But I believe that competing ideas are a good thing and things we can look at. So one of the other ones we can talk about is this project called Polymer. Now Polymer is a project from Google, and it's an early stage project. The goal of Polymer is to create a declarative set of XML tags and components that you can wire together with things like data binding and supplement with code. It's pretty much Flex, meaning that the ideas and the principles that they're trying to use and bring forward are exactly the principles that we're trying to do inside of Flex. It's actually a little bit funny because they're also making some of the same mistakes I think we made in Flex, but that's another story. So it's an interesting project though. It's interesting what it can do. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind here as we go forward. First, in alpha code. What does that mean? It means some things won't work, some things don't work. Some things did work, some things will work. This isn't production code. This is probably not something you should put into production later today or anytime in the near future. But it's a really cool setup and a really cool idea. It brings things that we didn't have before into the world of the web browser. And I think that's what the most interesting part about it is. So today we're going to learn a little bit about web components. We're going to learn a little bit about how Polymer works with web components, and then we'll actually look at a simple web component that's written so that we can get a sense, and you'll start, I think, seeing right away what I'm talking about when it looks a lot like Flex. All right. Actually, before we even go to that, let's look at the really simple little component. Actually, let's take two steps. First of all, just so we're on the same page, I showed you that little bit of the UI built on a JavaScript component. Polymer is a library that, again, gives us a number of things. So we'll see a lot of things in Polymer we're going through today: accordions, animated pages, arrows, breadcrumb trails, line charts, all the things that we're used to. And you'll notice they all look like tags. That's the goal of everything that we're trying to do here in Polymer, is that we're trying to make things look as much like tags as they used to, meaning that we have that same sort of idea that we have in Flex today of a tag-based environment in order to do things. This is the component that we'll probably take a look at when we're going through. It's actually two components that are data bound together. Here I pick a list of languages that are spoken, and here I choose a primary language. This data provider is simply bounded out. Two relatively simple little components, but they're going to be used to illustrate our point. Now, what I said was components, and that's the really key thing to all of these things about Polymer, is that we're trying to build components. So far, the web hasn't really had a component model. The web's had JavaScript, and we've had the ability to take a given chunk of JavaScript and maybe wrap it up and instantiate it all at once. But we've never really had a component model where there was an individual piece that was separate and somehow distributable separate from everything else. That's what web components are about. And Polymer, by the way, is about allowing us to use web components now, even though they're not completely improved as far as the specification goes yet. It's a combination of polyfills and polyfills, as they call them, in terms of probably work this way, that are set up in order for us to be able to use these techniques. And then, as browsers catch up, the pieces just get removed from the polyfills so that eventually they're not there, they're not needed anymore. All right, now Polymer is only targeting evergreen browsers. So on that side note, this isn't going to work on 87. It is basically just the latest versions of browsers is all they care about at this point. All right, that said, web components. The simple aim of web components is what's on the screen. I want to be able to define a tag like this that was text input or one of the tags that we were used to seeing in the browser, but I want to define my own. I want it to have its own properties. I want it to have its own configuration, its own styles and stylability. And then I want to be able to not only use it in this project, I want to be able to let people use it in other projects or reuse it throughout. I want to be able to create a real component, a first-class citizen of a component that exists inside the browser. Now, polyfills are the things I've been talking about. There's really three main things to Polymer. There's first of all, a set of polyfills, and that's the part that's most interesting to me right now, okay, which is the ability to create web components, even though we maybe can't do it in every browser yet. It's web components. There's a web application framework. This is the part that gets a little bit, to me, along the lines of maybe just a little too far in some cases. There's the equivalent of like HTTP service tags that we have in Flex, but they have them over here in Polymer, and we can do it all in XML and various stuff. And then finally, there's a set of UI components, which I do think are actually fairly interesting, which are giving us the ability to wrap up functionality and have things like infinite scrolling lists and all these sorts of things that we can create today and start using together. So Polymer is those three things. This is the part that I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about today. Obviously, we can talk a whole day easily about this, and I've done, on this same topic, I've actually did a 7-hour workshop recently. So this is just a little bit of what we're going to cover today, to be fair to you, because I don't think any of you are going to listen to me talk for 7 hours about this, to be honest. All right, web components specifically. This is where we need to cover. We need to understand first, what are web components? What problems are they trying to solve? What do they do? Can you use them? What does it mean in your development process? Now, web components are totally bleeding edge, right? They do not work entirely in any browser, okay? Different browsers implement different parts of the specification. The Chrome Canary, which if everyone's not familiar with, it is Chrome's sort of experimental leading edge version. You can download it and have it as a separate copy on your machine, separate than Chrome, so you aren't screwing up your daily builds. But Canary actually allows us to see some of what they're working on next, and we can enable even more experimental features. If you turn on all of the experimental features inside of Canary, then almost all of it works, okay? But that's about where it's at. Now, there is some support for all these things in every browser right now. So there's some support in WebKit, there's some support even in IE 11 for some of these things. It's not all ratified, it's not all together yet. So, why do I care then if we can't do it anywhere? Because this is something the web is missing. It's a component model. It's something that's really, really important. So far in the history of the web, people have found ways to be able to build things. And taking some parallels from the ActionScript and Flex community, this is 2004. This is where we were finding ways to build things in Flash before the Flex framework existed. And we would find ways to layer things together, and we would build our own components, and we put things together, and it could work, but it was hard to reuse, it was hard to debug, it was hard to maintain. What we're on the cusp of in the web environment is doing those same undertakings, which was that we're establishing a component model, establishing all these things to go forward. So while there's going to be some changes before it's final, this stuff is crucial to what's going to happen on the web. Okay? Now, beliefs aside about where you want to work platform-wise, doesn't matter to me. My general opinion is that it's good as developers that we know a bit about everything. We have to know a bit about everything. We don't know, right? There's always, once per year at least in a conference, somebody asks me if I'm going to learn just one language in my career as a software developer, which one should it be? Every year I get asked that question, and every year my answer is the same. English, so you can write your resume to do something different. Okay, you can't know one thing and work in software for more than 2 years. It was amazing that Flex, when, before it really had any problems, 8, 10 years, that we did before there was any real competition to it. And we may have a rebirth of being able to do more with Flex.js, but nonetheless, we need to understand multiple things. This is an important paradigm shift. It's called a tectonic shift inside of what the web browser does with web components. So it's really important. Okay, so goal and vision is what it's about for the next couple of years. Now, even though we can't do everything, one of the really interesting things about the web, one of the reasons that JavaScript on the web has made such an impact, is that they have a belief early on, a belief which can sometimes really mess you up, but a belief which is pretty cool too, which is that there's no particular reason that web objects that exist inside the browser should be sacred. What I mean by that is that if somebody wants to add a variation of the implementation of array to their particular web browser, you can do that in JavaScript. You can change array, right? Here, we can do the same thing, and this is where polyfills and polyfills come from. We can add pieces in JavaScript to the browser that don't exist inside the browser yet today. They're not going to run as effectively as when they're parts of the browser core. Okay, they may have some limitations, but they give us a chance to work with things beforehand, which means that we can also give feedback and participate and shape what something's going to look like before it's done. That's really important. In my time of watching Polymer and web components, these various specifications and arguments about it have changed dramatically. And a lot of that's because there's a lot of people that can give feedback instead of a small number of people who are making the decisions without anyone else seeing it. All right, so you can play with these things today. You can do stuff, and I have actually deployed limited and small stuff working on them, where I knew that it was not a big deal and we have control over it. But again, I need to start this way. This is a forward-looking session. This isn't what you should probably integrate in your workflow later today. All right? Okay, so why do we care about web components and Polymer? Well, because we can encapsulate, is what it comes down to. We can manage reuse. We can hide complexity. There's no reason that somebody needs to know how the internals of my object work in order to use it. That is kind of what happens in JavaScript today. But I should be able to drop a component on the page and just use it as an encapsulated component. I shouldn't have to worry about what ID someone used for a field inside of a component. You see, in JavaScript, in the DOM, proper, we can't duplicate IDs. So that means if somebody used an ID and called something grid in one part of the app, I have to make sure I don't reuse that. Well, that kind of sucks. And web components deal with that by basically setting up borders upon which things are encapsulated, and it doesn't matter what the IDs were. Same thing with CSS scoping and propagation. Just because I set a style in one area of the app shouldn't mean necessarily that that style propagates through every little individual part of every component. Maybe I want to have domain where certain styles to where to propagate things. So that's what web components are about. Think of it again as it's encapsulating functionality, much the way we did with Flex. It's bringing a piece together. It's allowing it to have its own styles. It's allowing it to manage its own internals in the way it works. And by the way, it gives us a distribution model too. So the other piece, though, that are two other pieces. One being slightly vindictive. This is what browser manufacturers have done for years. If you actually look, we can do this later. If you take a look at date time input in the browser, if you turn on all the debugging tools and you actually dive through it, you'll find out that the datetime component is really actually a component made up of JavaScript and of HTML. That thing isn't some special thing written in like assembly. It's written in HTML and JavaScript. So browser manufacturers for years have been able to wrap things up and make a component out of it that then we use. And we've just been ignorant to it because we said, okay, we want to use an input type date. It worked. But the point is that this is the first time that we're all getting the opportunity to do the same thing. Second thing, you can easily distribute these things. And third thing is markup and why. Just like I can put a text input on a page and use it, I should be able to put a data grid or something else on a page and use it. I shouldn't have to have a separation of things that I absolutely have to do these things in JavaScript, I absolutely have to do these things in HTML, or that some weird combination where I have to like make strings up and insert it into the DOM. That's what we're trying to get away from. We want to really use markup. Okay, so they're a draft specification right now, and they use these following components, parts. There's templates, decorators, shadow DOM, imports, and custom elements. Collectively together, these individual pieces, all of which are parts of the specification, add up to what we can do in order to make web components. But we need all of these pieces, okay? And this is the behind the scenes. So the first thing is templates. Templates should be a relatively easy and straightforward idea, so we won't spend a ton of time on them. But what a template is actually for is it allows you to have, think about it as something you can easily stamp out, right? It's a little template chunk of DOM that you can say that this is my little reference chunk and I want to clone it as often as I want to. So taking this back, think about the idea of something like an item render inside of a grid, right? I want to be able to clone as many of these as I want to, and I want to be able to do it easily and easily manage change. That's what templates are all about. Now, today, you can do something similar, but when you take a template today or when you take some HTML in the DOM, the moment you actually add, let's say, a div to the DOM, even if it's hidden, it's part of the render tree. What this means is that the moment you create a div today in a page, it's part of the active web page, even if it's hidden away. The big thing that makes HTML fragments different is it gives you a place to define pieces of the DOM which aren't actually on the DOM yet. So they're hypothetical. Someday they will be stamped out and be part of the DOM, but today they're hidden away. Why that's important though, is it means that today, when we do these things, we have to do them as strings, we have to do them as little chunks, and we don't want them on the DOM. This is giving us a proper way to deal with it where we keep markup and markup. So, like I said, today, when you look at people doing templates, what they do is they either make a div where it's display none, but in this case, by the way, this image right here, it's going to try to go out, it's going to try and go images products, and it's going to look for an image with that name as soon as the browser finds that piece of DOM, because it's just active. So we don't want that. So the second form of what we do is strings. We actually leave this in a string somewhere or in a script tag with a different type, and then we end up parsing it out and making something out of it. Either are particularly nice. Actually, it makes me a little sad. Also, it gives us no way to do validation. It gives us no way to defend, especially because people do things like load these strings from a random other website in order to get reuse out of them, and then after they've loaded them from another website, yeah, everybody. Wi-Fi here sometimes doesn't actually like to Okay, so the especially so if we load strings from multiple other sources and then just load them up and eval them into the DOM, we actually open ourselves up to potential attacks as well. It can cause a lot of problems that way. So that's nice. So instead, we have this template tag now, which is the basis of what we're going to do for doing components. And you're going to see in a moment. Template tag allows us to basically build a template that we can then stamp out over and over again. Now it's parsed, which means that the browser in the page is looking for errors in it. It will tell you if you have errors, it will tell you if you have problems, unlike if you do it as a string. But it doesn't actually put it on the DOM. It's just there. Get it? Okay. So we'll skip that for right now. Things moving forward. Decorators are another cool thing, which we won't get to just yet, because this is actually an official quote from the W3C specification of decorators, which is decorators, unlike other parts of web components, do not have a specification yet. So it's probably really pointless to talk about them too much. The general idea, though, is really cool. It's that you can actually define a little chunk of HTML and apply it over and over again. So imagine something, let's say in my application, I have in Flex, we would do something like $1 or currency formula, okay? But let's say that what we really wanted to do is we wanted to have something where every time we had a dollar amount, we wanted to be able to say, well, that should be decorated to look like currency. Well, what you can actually do is define a little div that shows a dollar sign, and it shows the period in the right place, and it basically takes the input of the currency, and then shows how it breaks out into this little template, and then you just apply it with CSS. So anywhere that you put a CSS style on it said like currency, you can use this decorator and all of your things get applied to it. So it's kind of like a lightweight version of templates that can be applied in line with styles. Okay, now Shadow DOM. Shadow DOM is the most difficult part of this to understand at first, but it's also the most important. It's encapsulation. Okay? It's at the heart of everything. So today, this is how browsers internalize things. As I had mentioned, if we go and actually look at a date time control or something like that today inside of a browser, we look at it initially as just a single tag, but if we were to allow the deeper debugging, we can see that it exists in multiple pieces. Those multiple pieces are called Shadow DOM. What Shadow DOM is it's basically an area of the DOM that's hidden from the rest of the world. So let's talk about that. Put it in Flex terms for a minute. What it really means is something almost like what we do in a UI component or something, but maybe to an extent a bit further. When we drop a UI component on the stage, we actually put it in a Flex application. The moment we do that, it sort of has its own rule set, right? It has its own area it can draw on. It has its own masking that can be applied. It has really, from that point on, sort of its own part of the display tree. And that part of the display tree is independent of anything else. Now, that little area, that little display list piece, we can pick up independently. We can move it somewhere else. We can drop it. We can do all these different things, and it moves as a whole. In that way, Shadow DOM is very similar. It allows us to take a range or a little area of a web DOM tree, pick it up and move it around as individual keys. But it allows one more thing. It allows us to hide the fact that it exists from the end user. So let's say jQuery, if everybody's used it, or in Flex. Like in Flex, we can go through, we can iterate all the children, and we can keep looking for a given ID, and we can walk all the way down the tree and look for and find something with an ID of. There's nothing to stop us from doing that. That's even worse because in the browser environment, we have all these tools which are specifically designed to do that. jQuery and things like this, which will search the whole DOM and look for something with a given ID. Well, how as a component manufacturer do I then stop somebody from reaching in the middle of my component and mucking about? How do I stop them from reaching right in and changing something about what I've done? Because you know what, those things I've done are probably for a reason. And maybe I don't want them all to necessarily be changed. That's what Shadow DOM is. Shadow DOM allows me to have this area, kind of like the UI component, but the borders of it to the rest of the world are a black box. Everyone else doesn't see it. They can't see inside it. They can't figure out what's going on. They can only see the black box. The way I explain it is often this way, right? The user sees this. It's a nice, simple little black box. It has controls. We can go forward, backward. We can do all these different individual things. There's not a whole lot we can do with it. This is what the browser sees. Okay? The browser understands that every point exists inside of it, but that's not what's presented to the user, and the user is not allowed to reach in and decide how to input the internals of it. They have to use the interface we've defined. Right? So this is just encapsulation again, but it's visual encapsulation of the components. Here's how it really works. What we do is in a document tree, and this is just like in the Flex display list, we have children, we have all these different pieces, and then we pull one section off and we say, hey, this one right here, even though it's going to look like one node to the rest of the world, it really is composed of these 10 pieces underneath which are hidden away. This is all encapsulated. This is what everyone else sees, but in reality, one of those nodes can be composed of a lot more pieces. That's what's going on with Shadow DOM. When we render it, by the way, it means that when it gets to that specific node, even though the rest of the world in the browser pretends it's one node, it briefly goes, oh yeah, I understand when I render it, I have to go in and do all these things. But just the browser sees those pieces. Nobody else does. Shadow DOM also forms a really important boundary for styles, meaning that what it does is that when you have a style that's set on the outside of the application or anywhere else, by default, styles don't cross the boundary of the Shadow DOM. So if I set a selector on the outside that says all of my fonts are going to be 500 points, it does not, by default, cross the Shadow DOM border, which means I don't really get to muck styles inside of a component unless the component developer specifically allows me to. So again, they can kind of declare what would have been like style inheritance for us in Flex. They can decide what styles are allowed to propagate through, what styles you can set on the component, but not everything moves through automatically. This, by the way, being a very common thing when you have JavaScript libraries, is that somebody internal to a given component simply says, okay, well, I'm going to use this, this particular line style to draw the thickness of the grid. And that's great. Well, then I'd say, okay, well, locally in my application, I would like all my lines to be 2 pixels, and now my grid changes too. And it was not intended side effect. That's what this is intended to stop. Okay, by the way, styles actually go both ways. So styles can be scoped locally to a component. I can have a style for a grid here that won't affect the grid on the outside either. So I also don't have to worry about names and name collisions. I can actually name the internal components of my component something reasonable. I can call a grid. I can call a line, and not fear that somebody else somewhere in the application is going to reuse one of those names. Okay, so HTML imports are one of the last pieces among this that are really important. They're really cool, even though they're really simple. You can't do this today. You can do this with polyfills, but what it really means is that you've seen link, and we use this in HTML in order to bring in a style today. But a link import allows us to bring in a chunk of HTML, just like you could in JavaScript chunk or something else today. What's important about that is that when we get to this whole component thing, these components are written in HTML. So this link metadata allows us to bring in a piece of HTML and make it part of our application, even though it was hosted externally. So we'll extrapolate from it. What this means is that we can have directories on a server for a project or for a company that have components, and we can reference them. We can treat them individually and load them up when we need to, bringing them into the application. We don't have to have everything in JavaScript library somewhere else. We can start having modularity to the actual components and decide what needs to get included on a piece-by-piece basis. So again, imagine this being a little bit more, if the original Flex stuff was a little more decoupled, this would be like being able to bring in text input without necessarily bringing in button or vice versa. Okay. All right. They aren't supported almost anywhere yet, but they are through polyfills. One thing to be careful about our HTML imports aren't necessarily blocking. You're basically saying, hey, I need this component in order for my application to run, which means you can't find it, and it waits until it can find it. Last thing, and this is the part that you see most visually, and this is custom elements. Now, custom elements are really cool because we're used to a bunch of elements inside of the HTML world. We're used to div, we're used to input, we're used to seeing these things. Custom elements, put simply, are the abilities for you to find your own elements that did not exist in the browser before you got there. You can create any name you want and register them. Obviously, Flex equivalent here is being able to make a class that we call XML. But here, we are making a component that the browser knows about. We can register the component. But just like input, the browser is going to happily accept our special component that we've made and go off and use it. It'll understand it, it understands how to render it. It works, it follows all the same rules, it flows in the same ways as all the other components. It's really allowing us to do the same thing browser manufacturers used to only be able to do. All right, they're allowed to manage state, they're allowed to provide scriptable interfaces. What do I mean by that? Well, the text input in the current version of the browser has things like a value property we can read and write. It has event handlers we can listen to and do things to. It has methods we can call. Same thing's the case. We can make our own methods. We can make our own properties. We can listen to events. Do anything the browser manufacturer can do with these pieces. So they're the shell. They look like this. This is how you define them. You define them by creating an HTML page. And again, looking a lot like Flex here, it starts with a tag element. And you tell it what it extends, okay, in this case, and then you give it a name. That name, by the way, is really important. See how I have a fancy dash button? The one requirement is that you have to have a dash in your component names. This is one of the ways that they've decided to separate it. All of the internal classes for browsers are guaranteed to never have dash names in any of their elements, and all of yours have to have dash names. So this is their way of making sure that somebody doesn't try and overload input through their own custom component and swipe password or do something along the lines of it, so that they're keeping those pieces separate. So that's the one requirement, is that you have to have a dash. Now, once you actually put your button on there and you've defined it this way, you can use it in any place in the application. It doesn't have to have some special way. There's no special instantiation. You just drop it in like you would any other component, and you use it throughout the application. So it gets really, really powerful. And for a moment here, why this is so powerful in my mind. Flex, really cool, really rich component styling. In my opinion, we always had a little bit of trouble with like advanced layout rules because the layout was very coupled to the way that flow worked and things like that. HTML layout rules and CSS layout rules, more complicated, sometimes maddeningly so, but you can do really cool things with them, and you can do a lot of stuff that we had trouble with, text flows, things like this inside of Flash. Well, combine that with the fact that you can do all those rules, those layout rules, and how you can drop custom components wherever you want. You have something really, really cool. It's pretty cool. Okay, so we have a fancy button. Now, custom elements, they use shadow DOM, okay? Which means that that custom element, since it has a shadow DOM, it hides everything inside of it, just like a text input was. We don't know what's inside of it. They also have a life cycle. It's very much like the Flex component life cycle. There's rough equivalents to initialize, pre-initialize, creation complete, all of those events you guys have probably handled in the past that actually happen and allow you to deal with something that have to be removed. It means you can take your application component and kind of like what Flex 4 was going for. You define the visual parts of how it looks in HTML. You define how it works in JavaScript. The two marry together, but they're actually separate. The look and the feel. Which, by the way, totally opens the model where somebody can actually take the JavaScript here component, but make it look different. Whether it's through styling or whether it's through a little rough what we call skin. Now, you can also do things like this, which is document.register option group. So this is a way if you wanted to not have to go through like that HTML syntax if you want to do things more in JavaScript. It's convenient at the moment because other than polyfills, that's the only one that works. Other things, Polymer and some of these other things, Polymer is only one of the projects that's trying to implement polyfills for web components. They're probably the most well-known of it, one from Mozilla called X tags. But they get a capability of giving us the ability to play with things today that would otherwise be all the way into a browser manufacturer had worked on them without us knowing about it. Okay, so here's a couple things before we go into some code. Polymer project, X tags, and if you really feel bored or having trouble sleeping at night, go ahead and read the full WT components implementation and spec. It'll get you right to sleep. Okay, code-wise, let's look at this component, right? Now, obviously, as I started showing you, there are many more UI-intense things, but the more UI-intense things we're going to get, the more complicated components are going to be. So I thought it might be useful to start with something a little simpler. Start with a component like this and just kind of walk through what we want it to be able to do and why, okay? And how it's going to work. So that's what we've done right now for this point. We're going to go ahead and take this language of spoken primary language thing. We're going to dissect it a bit. And we'll do it over here. So what I'm going to do, and we'll start with, we're going to build some of the internals, but I'm going to kind of show from the outside in what I might like this thing to look like. And then we'll kind of talk about how we want to implement it. So in this case, I wanted to have a language of selection component. All right? And this language of selection component, I thought it'd be really useful if I could provide a data provider. We're used to things like that, right? So in this case, I'm going to provide a data provider of the various ones that I wanted to display. Relatively simple, and again, you can see that it's just a tab that I've registered on here. Nothing terribly fancy or difficult about that part so far. Up here, you may notice a couple other things. First, right now I'm including two files from Google. One's called platform.js, one's called polymer.js. Technically, platform.js contains things that, when all is said and done, when everything is ratified all the way through, there will be nothing left in platform.js that you actually need in order to run these things on modern browser. So those are just pieces that are temporarily filled in and will basically, they more or less check themselves. What I mean by that is that when you load it up, they check to see if the feature already exists. If the feature doesn't exist in the browser, they have their code. If the feature does exist, they don't. Which means if you run this in Chrome Canary versus Chrome, although it works the same, in Chrome Canary, part of it's working on the core internals of the browser, whereas in Chrome, part of it's running through the JavaScript APIs. But you don't actually know the difference because they're working the same way. There are some limitations to that. There are some things, especially around CSS styling, which, because it's different, that whole order of CSS styling and things like that can't quite be done the same way, but they're really close. Last thing you see is the imports. This is me saying that I want to use that language selection. So that language selection code is in a completely separate HTML file. It's different than this class. It doesn't have to be put in here, and I can use it independently in multiple projects. I'm just pulling it in. That causes, when this browser starts up, for it to go off and get that page, or get that piece of HTML and any of its dependencies and bring it down before we actually start using it in the app. Get it so far? It doesn't work. The question was, I thought that I said the import the HTML isn't working. It doesn't work in any browser without the polyfill right now. So it's all polyfill. So even though it's part of the specification and a little further along, nobody except for the polyfill, I think, has it successfully implemented. Maybe in Chrome, but it's a very Chrome Canary. That's about it. Okay, but so that's the part though that brings it in. All right. Okay, so inside of this language selection one, we'll go a step further. And object group is where we're actually going to get into putting some code together. I'll show you what this looks like, and I think it's kind of cool. Object group defines an element. Now, in this case, we're defining a Polymer element. Polymer element really is just like that element tag I showed you. Polymer right now is adding a little bit of syntactic sugar, making the thing just a little bit cleaner so that we can do things. But you could actually write this thing as a core element. I just thought it was actually a little clearer to see some of what I was going on with a little less JavaScript and a little bit more syntax. So the Polymer element does a couple things. First of all, it defines what the name of this particular one is, which is language selection. So that is going to mean, by putting the name here, language-selection, means I can refer to this thing as language selection. If I didn't do this, if this doesn't get registered, in the browser, I'll actually see a warning in the window that says, I don't understand what the language selection component is. But the moment I've registered it, the browser now understands that that component maps to a given class and understands how to carry it through. Okay? So the language selection component is allowing us to define a given chunk of code that we're going to use and consider a component. Now, inside of it, it actually has, in this case, another part of our tag called attributes. Attributes are going to be pieces that we're allowed to set up the tag. In other words, attributes on a piece of XML are things like that are actually of a tag, right? So I can, by the way, some of the newer ID stuff actually does automatically, which is pretty cool. But attributes are things that I can actually set up a tag. So I'm defining the attribute on the tag itself. So just like text input can have things, I can have things. In this case, I decided that I wanted to be able to set the data provider this way. Incidentally, I can still set it through JavaScript. I can get a handle on it and I can set it like any other method. But in this case, I decided to go ahead and set it like an attribute. Okay? So an attribute is just a property that can be set internally, but in addition to it being a property, it's also settable via an XML directive. Right? Incidentally, and actually we might be able to see this, one of the cool things is, let's see, let's go down here, that's okay. I'll show you in a bit when we get to the other browser. Okay, so the next thing we see here is language selection actually needs another component. In this case, we have two components sort of nesting. It needs option group. So what that means is that when I get language selection, it understands, hey, I need option group. Now the browser makes sure that more than one copy of everything is loaded. It'll only load it once. But this actually allows us to have trees of things, which means that we can have one component that has a dependency on another. And the browser is going to resolve that for us by bringing the things in that we need to, okay, as we go along. So we use an option group here. Now inside of this, we're going to skip the template for a section and we'll come back to it. We have the script tag. And our script tag is basically just a little bit of a Polymer tag right now, which is defining our startup. You can think of this as our constructor for our language selection. So if we wanted to do other things inside of the constructor, we could here, but what I'm actually doing right now is providing a default value of an empty array in case somebody didn't provide anything, just so that it starts up with a default empty data provider. Okay? You'll see in the next section that we can actually vet this out to provide methods, provide properties, event handlers. We'll see it when we get more an option group. Now, I mentioned template. The template being the visual representation of what our component looks like. Because when we see it on the screen, we aren't going to see any of the rest of this junk. We really want to see what's inside the component. So what an object group is to the rest of the world is it, or what a language selection component is to the rest of the world is it's two of these object groups that are actually placed together and shown on the screen. Okay? And those are basically these two individual pieces here. The language is spoken, the primary language piece. Okay? Now, let's see if this will work. Remember, alpha. Keep in mind the alpha thing I said, okay? So, when we go through here, we can actually see a couple of interesting things. See this little thing that says shadow root? Okay? I'm going to go ahead and we can do a couple of things here. There's this little cool little thing which they move around on me every couple of days in order to have fun. 1 second. Oh, come on. Alright, it's hiding. That's okay. Sorry, folks. Okay, nonetheless, it doesn't matter. This is Chrome Canary. Chrome Canary is actually showing us something that regular Chrome doesn't by default, which is it's showing us that this is a single component. See the single little tab indentation there? It understands that this thing is exactly one component. Now, Chrome Canary allows us in this debug mode here to see what's inside the shadow root, and that's why we're allowed to open it up and see that there's these option groups inside of here. But that's a debug feature. That's not something that you actually normally would see. So for the rest of the world, we would normally see them just like that, with no other changes inside it whatsoever. It's extremely interesting when you get to see the fact that it really is kind of hiding things in the way that it's supposed to. throughout the rest of the application. Okay, so just want to show that really quickly in Canary as we're going through. Now, in regular Chrome today, we won't see that because regular Chrome doesn't yet fully support shadow, so it's just going to see these things as individual elements. It doesn't yet do it, but it's emulating the concept for us. Okay? Oh yeah, this frames per second meter is also something you can enable and turn on and off. It's actually pretty sweet to be able to some of these things that you can actually set up and things. If you get a chance sometime, look through here, and they move some things around as far as what's in here, obviously, because the things move around constantly, actually, in Canary. One thing about Canary that they will make sure that you understand right off the bat is that it is totally experimental and things can change anytime that they want to change them. There's a number of different configs and things like that that you can do in here to turn on and off the levels when you want to see them. Anyway, but yeah, Canary is pretty cool as far as you can see GPU memory, you can see tons of things about what's going on, and you can configure all sorts of experimental things. There's a whole section in here that you can go into experimental parts, which just like these, turn on experimental WebKit features, turn on this, and some of it even works. Only once in a while does it actually seriously implode. Okay, so anyway, there's Canary. Okay? All right, so killing that for just a moment, coming back here, we see that we have our two object group components. Now, if we go back here, we actually see the first little bit of syntactic sugar between them. This is the data binding syntax for what they're using inside of Polymer. So this is saying, I want this data provider bound to our data provider property. Okay? So the first group on top is set to exclusive false. In other words, it's not mutually exclusive. I'm using checkboxes. The second group is set to exclusive true. It is mutually exclusive, so it's rendering them as radio buttons. Okay? This is just a little component I wrote to kind of show this. The idea behind an option group was that I get a group of options, and sometimes I want them mutually exclusive, sometimes I don't, but I want somebody to select them and tell me what the value is. Now, in here, I see this. This one is going to be set to the data provider, and its value, which is what I'm setting, will actually populate a variable called selected languages, which is this guy. Okay? This one is using selected languages as its data provider. So what's coming out of this one is the data provider for the second one. So that's why as I remove or add things, the second one is just automatically updated because it's its data provider. Okay? Make sense to everybody? All right? That it is. Yeah, that's the whole thing. Okay. So it's basically starting with normally an element tag, in this case a Polymer element, okay? But starting with an element tag, it must define the name, the attributes that are available to this tag, and then in this case I'm importing links, I need something else. What's inside the template is the visual display of this component. If I put something outside the template, if I put something down here in input, that doesn't show up because that is not on the visual part. You can think of this template being the visual part of this component. Everything outside of there is for me to do, but it's not for anyone else to see. And we'll see that more in a minute because I'm going to have the next component we're going to go into. We're going to have a couple templates, we'll actually have multiples in. Right? Make sense? Okay. So this, we'll go piece by piece in the next one, uses two object groups. So the last thing we'll actually kind of do is put together what the object group is. Right? Now, the option group, I'm going to do a bunch of little cutting and pasting as we go along here, just so you don't have to watch me cut type it all, because as we proved this morning, that's not a great idea. But what we have here is that we have another element with named option group. So again, we're just recursing down the same strategy, right? This template is going to be its definable area, which is going to be where things are viewable. Okay, so whatever's in this template is what we're going to see. It has a special style here called host. And this style basically says, what do I want this component's core display to be? So host is a special CSS style tag, which implies that this particular component can have some default styles. What do I want the default styles of this one to be? And then I can use regular CSS selectors too. Like there's going to be a list in here, and I just style the list. Okay? But host really refers to me. What's the base of my component? Okay. So down here a little bit in our script tag, in this case, I said the default value is going to be exclusive as false. The default value for the data provider is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, and the default value is an empty array. Okay, nothing terribly exciting there. Okay, we'll populate this though as we go along. We'll start bringing things in. So one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to populate the rest of the actual template or the template area. And this gets pretty cool. You see, we can do these content tags as well as div tags. I'm going to explain what these do. Let's look at this one first. We're going to have something called a list, okay? And this thing is called a list, and it is just going to be a div right now. But it's where we're going to end up putting other parts and other things into it. Now, for styling purposes, for CSS purposes, we can tell things they have a part. And a part gives somebody on the outside the ability to apply a style to something inside our component, but only the things that we've decided they should be allowed to. So by giving something a part name, we're giving somebody a way to access it from the outside. Otherwise, they don't know that they don't have any ability to do so, right? And they can do pseudo selectors so that they can actually, on the outside, or here I'll actually do one here real quick. If they would have been styling on the outside of my component, they can do things like foo, and they can do a pseudo selector of list to be able to style those things. Okay, so here we have a list. Now we have these other two things which are kind of interesting. One of them is a content tag with select H2, and then there's another content. This H2 has something called title in it. How this works is that this allows me to pass content into this tag. So I have an option group here, and see how I have an H2, language is spoken. I can also put another div here, it just says foo inside it. What happens inside the option group is it takes this content, takes this middle of this tag, and it makes it available to me, the content tag. So people can pass things in that I want to do something with. My select of H2 says, hey, grab anything with an H2 tag, okay, and drop it here. If nobody gives me anything with an H2 tag, I will use my default, which is here, it'll say title. If somebody gives me something with an H2 tag, I'll use it. That's how this says language is spoken in primary language. The reason that worked is that I passed in language is spoken in primary language to the object group, and the object group grabbed those pieces and put it here. Okay? The select asterisk, and I can do as many of these selects as I want to. The select asterisk basically says, okay, grab everything else that I haven't otherwise pulled out. So if I would select H2, H3, H4, H5, H6, whatever the case was, and then asterisk will grab everything else. So what this is doing in this case is my div foo here would actually be grabbed by the asterisk and be down here below the list. What you're doing is you're giving people a way to be able to do a fair amount of stuff inside your component by giving them flexible regions that they're allowed to do things in inside your component. So imagine a scenario where I had a very special type of panel. Maybe I want to let them do anything they want in the panel's title. I can make that a given content area. Somebody can do what they want. I don't have to program in a specific set of rules that are allowed to go into the title. I simply give them a region and they can do whatever the heck they want in the title. That's what it's all about. Make sense? Okay. So content areas are pretty cool as far as how that works. Now, in addition to the content area, obviously we're going to need to make this thing start doing something. So in our case here, we had two types of things, an exclusive false and exclusive true component. So to me, as I mentioned, exclusive false is going to be rendered as checkboxes. Exclusive true is going to be rendered as radio buttons. So what I did was I created two more templates, because templates are this way that we can have a little piece of content that we can stamp out rapidly. And so for us, we'll have two more templates. One called exclusive temple, one called non-exclusive temple. And they're represented by a radio box and a checkbox. Now, because these are templates, I can grab them rapidly and just make as many copies as I want to. That's what templates for, right? Okay, so building on that a little bit before I lose everybody. There's only a few like glass over things going on right here. I can now actually add some pieces in here. Now, there's some really interesting things to what they will allow us to do inside of inside of these components. So I'm going to grab these two pieces real quick and we'll explain them. We're going to add two change handlers. We're going to try to add two change handlers in here. Exclusive changed and data provider changed. This is a little bit of syntactic sugar that Polymer does for us, which is really cool. If we have a property called exclusive, we automatically can have a function called exclusive changed. We have data provider. We automatically get a function called data provider changed. And we actually recall automatically with whatever the old value was when they change. So we have an automatic and implicit change handler for any property that's built for us. So while we're going to write these functions next, basically, if somebody changes exclusive from true to false, we empty the list, we're going to render a new one.
So as far as the templates go, is it just like the first one is the only one that gets rendered by default, and the other two are just not rendered yet?
Yeah, great question. So as far as the templates go, the main template that doesn't have an ID here is the template for this component. These other two that have IDs are just going to be defined chunks of stuff I can use later, but they don't have any bearing or visual display the component right now. Okay, and you'll see me using them in just a minute. Any other questions before going? Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and we grab exclusive change and data provider change, and we can actually do another simple one here. We have a value property, right? We already said that whenever something actually changed, we wanted to have it to the value property. So what we'll do is we will go ahead and make sure whenever our value changes, that we just, for right now, we're going to go ahead and cat that out to the console, just so we have something to see what's going on there. Okay? So anytime our value changes, we go ahead and we will we'll update that. Okay, going beyond our change handlers, let's actually pull these in just a couple pieces here to make things a little bit easier. So what we'll do is we'll look at empty list first. An empty list is pretty easy. What it's just going to do is it's going to say, when somebody calls either exclusive change or data provider change, I want to empty the list before I rerender it. And we get this little bit of sugar again that Polymer gives us. In this case, the dollar sign means I can refer to any piece inside this component by ID, but not have to really worry about those IDs again. Meaning that there's a div with an ID list here. Well, all I have to do is say this dollar sign list, and I get a handle to that particular piece without doing like a lookup and thing by ID or anything else. Just a little bit of sugar that allows me to have quick access to these pieces because we assume we'll need it over and over again. And then all I'm going to do is look through the list and remove all the children, and then go ahead and set the value to nothing. So that's what happens when the list gets empty. Now, the longer one, which we'll just copy up here and break down into pieces for now, is what happens when we get new data. We're going to render our list. So the first thing we do is we go ahead and we have list. So we grab a copy of our list, right? And we grab a copy of our data provider. Create a local variable named option template. And we check if we're exclusive. If we're exclusive, we do this thing called element.query selector, and we ask for our exclusive template, which is the one defined up here. Right there. Okay? So that's our exclusive template. If we're not exclusive, we can get our non-exclusive template. And this is how we work with templates. We do so by taking a template itself, the option template, and there's a special node under a template called content. And we can do content underneath there. We can actually query individual pieces. So in this case, what we're saying is, I want to query the input inside our template. Okay? And when it finds the input in the span, it's going to change the input value to whatever happened to be in the data provider, and it's going to right now change the inner text of the span to whatever happened to be in the data provider. So that means if we go and look at one of these things that's been rendered for us, the input gets the value of English inside the span with the value of English, and that's because of that line back here. And then it appends that child to our list. So our list now has that child. So very simple, all we do is snap out a couple copies of the template and we do it. Now, by the way, if we would have wanted to be a little bit sweeter, like their data binding expressions actually have loops and other things in them, so we could have probably done this all in XML, but sometimes it's beneficial to understand what's happening in the template. Okay, last thing we're going to actually do right now, or last two things, is we'll go ahead and we'll grab our handle selection change code. So what we want to do here is that anytime a selection changes, we want to set the under private variables to empty array. We want to go through and we want to ask for every place where one of our inputs is checked. And then we just want to push those values to our value property and then set it on our value, our local attribute. Okay? When we do this, that'll allow other people to access it. And in fact, the very last thing we'll do is this, which is we'll add two new attributes to our group. One of them being, or three new attributes, one of them being exclusive data provider, and then value, which will allow other people to data bind to us, okay, our value property. And then we do this piece, on click. When any of our elements are clicked, we're going to call handle selection change, which is going to do this Now just going back for a moment, we set a value property. Over here, someone's using the value property, and that's actually how we're getting everything bound back together. So the value property of this one becomes the data provider on the side. Okay? The net result is that we end up with a component where we're able to change the value property in one, and we can therefore get the rest of it the other. That's the gist of it. That's what's going on inside of this whole piece and everything that goes on in this option group. And it's actually pretty slick. I mean, honestly, you can build using these fundamental techniques in these small pieces. You can build into relatively large components by just building on top of each other. But the most important and exciting part for me is that this, right? We have a tag, a custom tag of our own, which, yeah, we took a little bit of time to write once, but we can use it over and over again. We can use this option group, which I have used, by the way, over and over again in different places inside of applications wherever you want to, because all you actually have to do is one in, and you're good to go. Now, the Polymer library itself, just as a starting point, actually is composed of a bunch of things right now. These are the core pieces. So under core, we have things like import panels and fields and header panels and icon buttons and all these sorts of inputs. Then they have a whole UI project, which is their accordion, their action buttons, and animated pages. And you can see all these work. So, like if we were to go pick up one of them, here we'll grab tabs. You can see their demo application for tabs. It's very simple stuff, right? To like get them in here. Is they're all built in the same way, so we're actually able to continue to use these things and link them individually and start bringing them together.
Are there any kind of spec for like I don't know, like obfuscating or somehow hiding your components? Because once you have the import in there, putting you've got HTML.
So the question was, is there any support for some type of obfuscation or minification? You can obfuscate and minify all the code, but at the end of the day, no matter how much you obfuscate and minify it, yeah, there's a URL, and if somebody wants it, they're going to go grab it. And although we forget that, the same was true with everything with Flash and Flex, because as many times as Adobe told me they couldn't have the code and I somehow got it anyway, I can tell you that it was relatively easy to decompile things. So there's a number of ways to go about that. So yeah, you may have taken one extra step before, but it took one extra step. And as much as you can minify things, yeah, you can do that, but even Chrome these days, by the way, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but if you go into Chrome, it's so nice because if I were to pick out something and be like, oh, can you show me this code? Oh, this thing is all a mess. Well, that's fine, but we can just ask Chrome to go ahead and make that pretty for us, and it'll smooth things out and do all sorts of things for us in order to make it pretty. Within browsers, within everything else, even obfuscation more so than minification, but they have, there's some advantage to them, but it's minimal. Okay, in any case, these UI components, these pieces exist. The subtopics and pieces exist within here. All of these pieces are free. Every bit of it is free to use right now, and it works. And you can actually build some relatively intense things by building one of these things on top of another. Now, that first piece I showed you back at the beginning, that first application, was actually because of the fact that the component manufacturers that are out there in the world, some of them are starting to play with using this model for everything they distribute. So people like Kendo and others who have actually done fairly impressive component models on what exists out in the world are starting to migrate their code on top of a Polymer base and a web component base so that they now have components which would interoperate. This is the really interesting thing to me that's really so important, is that if everyone started adhering to this, you would be able to grab one component from Kendo and one component from someone else that you liked and drop them on a page and use them together. Today that's not really possible because every one of them wires together like this. But once we start actually embracing that sort of idea and follow it, we can grab these components from all over and we can use them to assemble an app. Okay? So there's some really cool things. And in general, Polymer is a really cool idea as far as it goes. It's also really not unfamiliar to those of us who've played with these things before. That's okay. Everything new has been invented before, apparently, and there's no exception here. As far as these different pieces come together. But you can have a fair number of interesting pieces, and all of these are actually kind of cool because the source code for everything is available, so you can see how they're built up and how they come together. The docs for everything are on polymer.project.org. Here's the main piece. This is the say the building blocks for the web is what they're after, what they're trying to go for, is being able to build through these pieces. So I guess the big thing I'm trying to encourage people to do is take a look at this and maybe go play with it. It really is, for a flex dev especially, really easy to get up and running. It would probably take you about half an hour to have a basic app up and running. Just kind of the skeleton of it. Because you'll be like, all right, how do I get data? Oh, okay, well there's a core AJAX service which goes and gets data. By the way, it looks almost like HTTP service. And it has a result event and data binding. Oh, and then I can take that and there's a list class and I can bind to it. Oh, and look, I can provide a template for what the item renderer is. And pretty much, just kind of one by one, you get the basics of things up and running really, really fast. This is really, really close to the things that we've worked on before. Yeah. Timeline's on. So they're not going to tell you, right, because it's Google. I mean, Gmail is technically still beta, right? So, what's that? Right, so, the question is when is it usable? It's probably better. And my answer, and I mentioned I use this, in places that I control, that I'm relatively okay with having a slower update cycle, I don't mind using it already. I'm okay with that. Are there bugs? Yeah, in fact, it's tiny. I like to point out how tiny it is. But I actually got a submission into that acceptance. So technically I'm a contributor on that project too, but I think I switched to not equal when equal. But the gist is that it actually works reasonably well now, and there are support folks on the forums. They have a fairly good community, so it's pretty active on people being able to answer questions. You can get something up and running in for intranet stuff. Yeah, I'm using it already. I'm using it, it's just fine. If it were wider distribution stuff, probably 6 months before I'd be terribly comfortable with it, simply because of the fact that there's a lot out there, there's a lot that's changing. And it does, from version to version right now, update quite a bit, because of the fact that, of course, this is all being argued as far as what the web standards are going to be. So one of the things I changed earlier today is I showed you guys that on-click. That was called on-change last time I used it. The latest update changed it. Okay, well, it's pain. But what did it take? It took me a couple minutes to log in, I was up and running again. Wasn't that big of a deal, but it would be a real pain if I were, in a more production-oriented environment. But yeah, as far as internet stuff or things that I have more control over, I'm kind of using it now. There's separate projects if you Google them for the Kendo board for their components on top of Polymer and for several of the other ones that are located. There's also a community section on this website, Polymer website, which lists off some of the projects that are going on. But it's certainly worth taking a look at and seeing how it comes together. It may not be the ultimate, Polymer itself may not be the ultimate solution that wins or loses or anything else. But web components, which are what it's really trying to get you to play with now, not only are they here to stay, I think they're a significant portion of what being on the web and developing for the web is going to be for real application developers in the next few years. That's going to be, to me, it's that shift again. It's going from we're scripting to we're writing apps. Real apps require some layer of encapsulation. This is a really potentially good model for doing UI encapsulation.
So is this HTML5 or is this HTML6?
The question is it HTML5, is it HTML6, is it HTML10? And since they're all buzzwords, I don't know what the answer is for that. All of these things are part of the argument around what the HTML5 standard are. So it's not past that in any way. But the HTML5 standard isn't actually due to be ratified for another 10 years or so. So I'm not kidding, I'm not actually joking on that. Okay? It's technically 9 at this point or something. But that doesn't mean, CSS2, we're still waiting for, I think, official, or maybe it just got a ratification, but we've been using that for 8 years. It doesn't mean that you won't be using these things all along. It just means that, in the background, they won't officially be stamped off on some place. But most of what we do isn't. That was the longest thing. I remember back when, the center tag was controversial. So these pieces, I'll get you a second door. As far as using these pieces go, and things like that, I wouldn't worry too much about where they are or what standard they're going to be. The bigger question would be if for some reason all of a sudden the whole idea of what components got scrapped, but it's fairly supported. There are some things out there that are just Google pushing for something, and I think those things are a little riskier. This actually has fairly broad support from the folks at Mozilla, the folks from Google. Once you actually see industry giants support on something, the chances of it, coming through being fairly permanent are much better. Okay.
is there any kind of spec for like having documentation format? For example, since stuff isn't tagged, you won't know what those values are supposed to be.
Right. So the question was about documentation and formatting, what types are supposed to be. Yeah, and this is actually some of where other frameworks like these get in. There's a number of people that have proposed commenting strategies that are competing right now. Somebody will win out eventually on what things are supposed to be. But it's also JavaScript, which means there's a relatively good chance that if you pass something to it, it's going to transform it into what you want. Meaning, like, it's a very JavaScript-y thing. If I were to have passed into that value or that data provider property something that wasn't an array, that it would wrap into an array. That tends to be the way that their methodology works around a lot of these frameworks. But yeah, there'll be docs and there'll be things like that. And I think the Google Docs are actually pretty good on the other components, but not the ones I wrote just before the session. But docs are also really bad. Any other questions? What do you think? Interesting? All right. Well, thank you for your patience. We got just a little bit of time. I think about 20 minutes or so before the next session begins, so stretch your legs and we'll go from there. Thanks.